The sound was wrong. Piotr Kowalski froze on the trail, one boot suspended over a patch of soft moss. His brain registered the anomaly before he understood it. Not the crisp snap of a deer breaking a twig. This was the crunch of a boot deliberately placed, then shifted to test the ground's firmness. Human. 30 meters south-southwest. He lowered his foot in silence. It was March 14, 1943. Dawn light filtered through the pines in cold gray spears. Piotr was 53 years old. He had been the forester for this 42-square-kilometer sector of the ancient Białowieża Forest for 30 years. In that time, he had filled 10 leather journals with 6,000 observations. He knew the weight of a red deer stag in autumn was 420 kilograms. He knew a wolf pack could travel 50 kilometers in one night. He knew the warning grunt of a wild boar was 7 hertz lower than its feeding sound. Now he knew a German reconnaissance patrol was moving toward him. He saw them 3 minutes later. 3 soldiers in field gray. They moved in single file along the deer trail. The lead soldier was a corporal with a scar cutting through his stubbled chin. He held an MP-40 submachine gun across his chest. The man behind him was young, maybe 20, his eyes constantly scanning the trees. The third soldier carried a map case. Their boots left perfect impressions, with 8 rectangular studs in the damp earth. Piotr memorized the pattern. He did not breathe. He stepped into the clearing as if he belonged there. The patrol stopped. 7 meters separated them. The corporal's finger slid to the trigger guard. Piotr's mouth felt dry. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum he was certain they could hear. Halt! The corporal barked the word. The young soldier raised his rifle. The sound of the bolt being worked was obscenely loud in the quiet forest. Piotr raised his empty hands, slow and deliberate. He wore the worn leather manchette of his office on his left arm. In his right hand was his ashwood walking stick and his current journal. He looked like what he was, a forester, a non-threat. The corporal's shoulders dropped half an inch. "Do you speak German?" The corporal's Polish was heavy and awkward. Piotr shook his head. He pointed to the manchette, then to the trees around them. He was a part of the landscape, a fixture. The corporal studied him for 10 seconds. The young soldier's knuckles were white on his rifle stock. Partisans. The corporal made a sweeping gesture with his hand. "Where?" Piotr looked genuinely blank for a moment. Then he shook his head again. He pointed east, away from the creek bed where he had hidden blankets and salt in a rotten log 2 days prior. "Empty," he said in Polish. The corporal stared. Piotr's bladder felt suddenly full. A cold trickle of sweat traced a path down his spine beneath his wool shirt. He kept his face a mask of simple confusion. He was a forester. He knew trees, nothing more. Finally, the corporal nodded. He waved his men forward. They moved past Piotr, close enough that he smelled the stale tobacco and wool grease on their uniforms. The young soldier kept his eyes locked on Piotr until the last possible moment. Then they were gone, swallowed by the dense pine. Piotr did not move for a full 2 minutes. His hands began to shake. Not a tremble, but a violent, uncontrollable vibration that started in his wrists and rattled up his forearms. He clenched them into fists until the nails bit into his palms. The pain grounded him. He took 5 deliberate breaths, each one smelling of damp moss and his own sour fear. The patrol was heading east. They would find nothing, but they would be back, and the next patrol would not be so easily redirected. That evening, he walked 4 kilometers north to the village of Krasna. His legs ached from the tension of the day. He found Father Tomasz in the stone church lighting candles. The priest was 62. His hands trembled from arthritis, but he methodically lit each wick. The air smelled of beeswax and old incense. "They are in the forest, Piotr." Father Tomasz spoke without turning around. He knew the sound of the foresters' footsteps. 6 families, from the town of Losis, and 2 Red Army boys who jumped from a prison train. One has a fever. They cannot move fast. Piotr said nothing. He watched the candle flames dance. The Germans are bringing in special units next week. The priest whispered the words. They will sweep the forest. They will find them. How much time? Piotr's voice was a rasp. He had not used it since speaking to the corporal. Days. Father Tomasz turned. His eyes were exhausted. Maybe a week. If they are not found, they need a path, a way deeper. You are the only one who knows the forest well enough. Piotr looked down at his own hands. They were the hands of an old man, scarred from axes, stained with tree sap, nails packed with soil. They had never held a gun. They were good for identifying tree blight and measuring animal tracks. For 30 years, his expertise had been the silent, cyclical life of the forest. It was a peaceful profession. It was all he knew. Now it was the only weapon he had. He returned to his cottage at the forest's edge. His wife, Magdalena, placed a bowl of cabbage soup before him. She saw the new rigidity in his shoulders, the distant focus in his eyes. "Piotr," she asked. He did not answer. He pulled his newest journal from his satchel. He opened it to a fresh page. But he did not write about the health of the oaks or the new fox den he had found. He began to draw a map, not of trees, but of choke points, not of animal trails, but of sight lines. He marked the 32 places where the forest's geography could confuse or delay a man with a map, where sound behaved strangely, where shadows pooled deepest at twilight. Magdalena watched from the doorway for a long time. Her husband was transforming before her, his peaceful knowledge curdling into something tactical and sharp. She finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "What are you doing?" Piotr did not look up. His pencil moved with a precision born of 3 decades. "I am learning the forest again," he said. "This time I need to learn how to make it scream." He had 1 week, 42 square kilometers, 11 hidden lives depending on him. And the only arsenal he possessed was 30 years of listening to the wind in the pines. The first test would come in 48 hours. He would fail it. The first failure happened 12 hours later. Piotr stood in a gully at 0200 hours, a hand-carved willow reed at his lips. He blew. The sound that emerged was a weak, breathy whistle. It died in the damp air after 20 meters. He tried again, adjusting his tongue. Another whistle. A real wounded boar produced a guttural roar that vibrated in the chest, a sound of rending tissue and fury that carried for 300 meters. This was the sound of a sick squirrel. He threw the reed against an oak in frustration. It bounced off the bark and vanished into ferns. His hands trembled, not from cold, from the crushing pressure of the calendar. 6 days remained, 6 days to turn 30 years of passive observation into an active weapon. He retrieved the reed. His knuckles were white. For 30 years, Piotr had used sound to locate, not to deceive. He had mimicked mating calls to census populations. He had reproduced distress signals to lure predators for tracking. The purpose was always clarity, accuracy, truth. Now he needed to weaponize ambiguity. He needed the forest to lie. He worked until dawn. The principle was simple. 2 reeds bound together, one 8 millimeters shorter than the other, blown simultaneously. The interference of the airstreams created a rasp, a vibration. The execution was agony. His lips cracked and bled by the 4th hour. His lungs burned. He produced screeches, honks, wet gurgles. Nothing usable. At 0:05:50, as the sky lightened, he finally found the angle. He tilted the reeds downward, focused the air across the top of his tongue, and forced the sound from his diaphragm, not his throat. The noise that erupted was not perfect, but it was unrecognizable. It was a raw, alien shriek that echoed off the pines. A jaybird fell silent. Perfect was the enemy. He needed terror, not authenticity. The next component was time. A German patrol moved at an average speed of 2 kilometers per hour in dense forest. They stopped to check maps every 400 to 600 meters. Each stop lasted between 90 seconds and 3 minutes. Piotr needed to know these numbers precisely. He could not guess. For 2 nights he became a ghost tracking ghosts. He followed 3 different patrols, maintaining a distance of 150 meters. He moved with a silence born of 3 decades, placing each foot on pre-selected patches of moss or bare earth. He counted their steps. He timed their halts with his father's pocket watch. He noted where they looked, where they hesitated, where they felt safe. He learned that soldiers always paused where 2 trails crossed. They always avoided thickets of young spruce. They trusted their maps more than their eyes. He compiled the data in his journal. Patrol size 2-4 men. Average speed 1.9 km/h. Stop frequency every 550 meters. Stop duration 2.1 minutes. Boot stud pattern 8 rectangular. He now knew his enemy's rhythm. The next step was to disrupt it. The physical traps were the most dangerous work. They required altering the forest without leaving a trace of human hands. On the 3rd night, he targeted a key choke point, a narrow pass between 2 granite boulders. A fallen birch log, 90 centimeters in diameter, lay perpendicular to the trail. If shifted 3 meters north, it would force a patrol into a muddy depression. He did not drag it. Dragging leaves gouges in the soil. He used 2 pine poles as levers. He inserted them beneath the log, applied his weight, and gained 2 centimeters. The wood groaned. His back muscles screamed in protest. He leveraged again, another 2 centimeters. The process was glacial. After 1 hour, he had moved the log 47 centimeters. Sweat soaked his shirt. His breath came in ragged gasps. He did not stop. He worked for 5 hours until the log was precisely positioned. He then spent another hour, camouflaging the disturbed earth with fallen leaves and forest debris, using a pine branch to mimic the random scatter of the wind. When he finished, his hands were raw and bleeding. A deep, hot pain settled in his lower back, a persistent knot that would never fully leave him. He vomited from exhaustion behind a bush, the bitter taste of bile mixing with the taste of pine sap. The sound system required a network. He could not be everywhere. He needed the forest itself to seem reactive. He spent a day rigging simple trigger lines. He used dark fishing wire, nearly invisible, strung between trees at ankle and chest height. When tripped, they would release a bent sapling, creating a sudden swish of movement, or pull a dead branch from a careful perch, generating a dry crack. He set 18 of these lines along 3 primary trails. Each one took 30 minutes to rig without leaving sign. Each one was a potential mistake that could reveal his entire operation. His 4th night was almost his last. He was testing a sequence of sounds near the eastern ridge. Boar roar to the north, wolf howl to the east, a crack of a branch to the south. He moved quickly between positions, a 63-year-old man running a brutal circuit in the dark. As he rounded a thick spruce, his foot caught on a root. He fell forward. There was no time to catch himself. His right knee slammed into a sharp rock hidden under moss. A bolt of white-hot pain shot up his leg. He bit down on a scream, his teeth cutting into the inside of his cheek. The coppery taste of blood filled his mouth. He lay still, panting, listening. Had he been heard? Minutes passed. The forest was silent. He tried to stand. His knee buckled. A sharp, grinding pain told him it was not just bruised. He crawled to the spruce, pulled himself up, and put minimal weight on the leg. It held, but each step was a fresh jolt of agony. He had to abort the rehearsal. The patrol was still out there. He hobbled 2 kilometers back to his cottage. Each step a small eternity. By the time he reached the door, his trouser leg was sticky with blood. Magdalena was waiting. She said nothing. She helped him inside, cut away the fabric and cleaned the gash. It was 7 centimeters long, deep enough to show white bone before it welled with blood. She stitched it with a needle and thread, her hands steady. Piotr stared at the ceiling, his jaw clenched. She did not ask how it happened. When she finished, she placed a hand on his damp forehead. Her silence was louder than any accusation. The next day, he could not walk. The fever set in by afternoon. He lay in bed, shivering, while the clock ticked down. 72 hours left. He had reeds but no reliable network. He had traps but no integrated system. He had data but no proven method. And he had a leg that screamed if he moved it. On the 5th day, the fever broke. The leg was stiff, swollen, but could bear weight. He rose at dawn. He had lost 4 kilograms. His face in the mirror was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He drank water and went back to work. There was no choice. He enlisted Father Tomasz for a full rehearsal. The priest was a poor substitute for a soldier, but he was a second pair of ears. Piotr positioned him at the head of a trail. He then executed his sequence from hiding places, moving on his injured leg, the pain a constant metronome in his skull. First, a low wolf howl 100 meters west. Father Tomasz froze. Good. Second, a boar roar 80 meters north. The priest turned his head. Third, the crash of a pre-rigged deadfall 60 meters south. Father Tomasz took a step backward. Fourth, Piotr used 2 reeds at once, a lynx screech overlaid with a roe deer's bark, creating a dissonant chorus from the east. The priest's hand went to his chest. He looked genuinely afraid. After, Father Tomasz was pale. "I would have run after the 3rd sound," he admitted. "You made the forest feel crowded." Piotr nodded. That was the goal. But sound alone was a specter. It could not block, only suggest. He needed one more element, a signature. On the final day, he created it. He found a rotten, hollow stump. He carved a small hole in its side. Inside, he placed a single reed angled upward. He rigged a trigger line so that anyone passing would pull a pin, allowing a stream of air to be forced through the reed by a weighted, collapsing bladder made from a goat's stomach. It would produce one long, mournful note as the patrol left, a sound with no clear source, a forest sighing at their backs. He called it the ghost note. It was the final piece. On the evening of the 7th day, Piotr stood at the edge of the clearing behind his cottage. His body was a catalogue of pain. The seamed cut on his knee, the permanent ache in his lower back, the blistered lips, the raw throat. He had crafted 14 reeds. He had set 23 trigger lines. He had moved 4 major logs. He had mapped 32 ambush points. He had rehearsed the sequence 17 times. He had failed, adjusted, and failed again for 168 hours. He was ready, or he was not. There was no middle ground. Magdalena came out and stood beside him. She looked at his profile, at the new hardness in his face. She spoke softly. "You have taught the forest a new language." Piotr did not look at her. "It is not a good language," he said. "No," she agreed. "It is a language of fear." She paused. "Can you still hear the old one? The true one?" Piotr listened. He heard the wind. He heard a distant woodpecker. But beneath it, he now heard the geometry of choke points and the timing of patrols. The forest had become a system of vulnerabilities and advantages. The truth was gone. He had murdered it to save 11 lives. The first real test would come at dawn. A patrol was scheduled according to the pattern. They would walk into his symphony of lies. He knew their speed, their habits, their fears. He had their rhythm in his bones. But one question remained. a cold stone in his gut. He had trained against his own expectations. He had not trained against a soldier who, in his terror, would do the one thing Piotr could not predict. The patrol arrived at 617 hours. Piotr saw them first as shadows separating from the deeper gloom of the pine trunks. 4 men. He recognized the formation from his charts. A loose diamond. They moved with the professional caution he had timed. Every 20 paces, the point man paused, his head tilting to listen. 70 meters from Piotr's first trigger line. He was positioned 8 meters up a massive fir tree, his back against the rough bark, his injured leg braced on a thick branch. The pain was a dull, familiar throbbing. Below him, hidden in a nest of ferns, was reed cluster 1, the boar call and the lynx screech. A length of dark fishing line ran from the cluster up the tree to his hand. The point man stopped exactly where Piotr predicted. Trail junction Gamma. The soldier knelt, examining the ground. Piotr had placed a partial boot print there 3 hours earlier, using a cast he'd made from mud. It was shallow, imperfect, but convincing in the low light. The soldier gestured silently. His team closed up. Now, Piotr pulled the line. Below, a mechanism of bent twigs released. The boar call emitted a low, wet gurgle that built into a full-throated roar. The sound seemed to originate from a thicket 30 meters to the patrol's left. The effect was instantaneous and textbook. All 4 soldiers dropped into a crouch, weapons snapping toward the sound. The point man raised a clenched fist. They froze. Piotr counted. 1 1,000, 2 1,000. They were waiting for a visual, for movement. They were professionals. A single strange sound was not enough. He pulled the second line. The lynx screech ripped through the air. A woman's scream filtered through broken glass. It came from the opposite direction, 60 meters to their right. The patrol's cohesion broke. The rear guard spun, his MP-40 pointing at empty trees. The point man looked left, then right, his head swiveling. The map bearer said one sharp word. Fear. Piotr saw it in the sudden stiffness of their shoulders, in the way they now stood with their backs to each other, covering a full 360 degrees. They were no longer hunters, they were a perimeter. Piotr executed Phase 2. He blew his own reed, a soft, coughing grunt of a deer. It came from directly behind them, 10 meters off the trail, an impossible direction. The young rearguard fired. 3 rounds shattered the morning silence. The bullets tore through ferns and smacked into a pine. No target, just noise answering noise. The sergeant barked a furious order. The firing stopped, but the damage was done. The shot had violated their doctrine. It had announced their position to a forest they now believed was alive with hostiles. The sergeant made a sharp cutting motion with his hand. Retreat. They moved back down the trail, not running, but with a swift, disciplined haste. They did not look back. Piotr waited, motionless, for 20 minutes. His hands ached from gripping the branch. His mouth was dry. He had done it. He had turned them back without being seen. A flush of wild, savage triumph heated his chest. It lasted for 3 seconds. Then the cold reality washed over him. They had fired. That was the unpredictable variable. A terrified soldier could spray bullets blindly. One of those bullets could have found him, or worse, it could have flown 2 kilometers northeast and found the refugee camp. His system had worked, but it had also escalated. He had not just scared them. He had provoked a military response. He climbed down, his injured leg buckling slightly on the last step. He checked his reed cluster. The bore call was cracked from the mechanism's release, 1 of 23 assets, already expended. This was not a game of perfection. It was a game of attrition. He reported the success to Father Tomasz that evening. The priest, allowed himself a small, tight smile. He said the families were ready to move along the cairn path at midnight. Piotr nodded. He did not mention the gunfire. The next test came 48 hours later. A different patrol, larger. 6 men, including a Feldwebel with a pistol on his hip. They did not use the trails. They moved through the underbrush, a slow, sweeping advance. They were searching for something specific, for the source of the sounds, for him. Piotr observed from a distance of 200 meters. This was a problem. His trigger lines were on trails. His sound clusters were positioned for predicted routes. This patrol was creating its own path. They would bypass his entire network and walk directly into the heart of the protected zone. He had to improvise. He moved parallel to them, using a game trail he had not walked in years. His knee screamed in protest with each hurried step. He had to get ahead of them. He had to herd them. He reached a small, rocky creek that cut across their path. The water was only 10 centimeters deep, but the stones were slick. It was a natural barrier. He positioned himself on the far side, concealed by a fallen spruce. He had only his personal reeds. No triggers, no preset chaos. As the first soldier approached the creek bank, Piotr used the wolf howl. Not the full, practiced call, but a truncated, urgent version, the sound of a pack closing in. He threw his voice by cupping his hands, making it seem to come from the patrol's left flank. The Feldwebel stopped. He held up a hand. His men knelt. They were good. They were listening for the source, not just reacting. Piotr gave them nothing. Silence. After a minute, the Feldwebel gestured forward. They began to cross the creek. The third soldier slipped on a stone, his boot plunging into the water with a loud splash. The noise covered Piotr's next move. He scrambled 15 meters upstream, wincing as a branch scraped across his stitched knee. He unleashed the boar roar and the roe deer bark in quick succession. 2 distinct threats from 2 new directions. The patrol froze in the middle of the creek. They were exposed, confused. The Feldwebel was scanning the tree line, his face a mask of frustrated calculation. He could not identify the threat. He could not return fire. He was trained for an enemy he could see. Piotr struck the final blow. He used the ghost note reed, the one he had buried in the stump. He had rigged it here as a test. He pulled the hidden line. From the dense thicket directly behind the patrol came a long, low, vibrating moan. It was not an animal sound. It was the sound of the forest itself exhaling in sorrow. It was unnatural. It was wrong. That broke them. The Feldwebel barked a command. The patrol did not retreat in order. They clambered out of the creek and moved west in a near run, abandoning their sweep formation. They left behind a single item, a field cap caught on a branch. Piotr retrieved the cap later. It was standard issue, gray wool, slightly damp. Inside the sweatband was a name, written in careful cursive, Geffer H. Brandt. He held it for a moment. Heinrich Brandt. A person. Then he buried it. He had succeeded again, but the cost was mounting. His improvisation had been messy, rushed. He had been forced to move, risking exposure. His knee was swollen again, hot to the touch. Each engagement was draining his small reserves of energy and luck. 5 days passed, 5 interceptions, each one unique. Patrol 3 retreated after Piotr used only visual tricks, animal pelts swaying in the wind. Patrol 4 was more stubborn, requiring the full 10-minute sequence of sounds and triggered deadfalls before they withdrew. Cursing. Patrol 5 was the true lesson. It was a small patrol of 2 men, likely a messenger team. They moved fast and light. Piotr caught them in a narrow defile and used his standard opening. The boar, roar. The lead soldier did not freeze. He did not crouch. He immediately threw himself flat against the north wall of the defile, pulling his comrade down with him. A perfect, tactical response to potential ambush. They waited in total silence for 5 minutes. Piotr, confused by their lack of reaction, remained still. Then carefully, the lead soldier began to crawl forward, using the terrain for cover. They were not retreating. They were advancing toward the sound, using disciplined fire and movement tactics. They were adapting. Piotr felt a chill that had nothing to do with the forest damp. They were learning. The trick only worked if the target behaved predictably. These men were not. He had to break their discipline. He used the last resort, a simultaneous trigger of 3 separate sound clusters around them, creating a perfect triangle of noise. The cacophony was overwhelming. It finally convinced the 2 soldiers to withdraw, but they did so covering each other, moving with tactical precision. They were not panicked. They were regrouping. That night, Piotr lay awake. The system was fragile. It was a house of cards built on German assumptions about partisan behavior. Once those assumptions changed, the house would collapse. He had stopped 7 patrols. He had saved the refugees precious time. But he had also taught the enemy. He looked at his journal, open to a map. He had drawn a small red circle around a sector 5 kilometers to the east. Intelligence, gleaned from fragments of conversation overheard by Father Tomasz, suggested a major German sweep was being planned there. A company-strength force, over 100 men. His reeds and fishing wire would be useless against 100 men. They would simply march through the noise. They would find the cairns. They would find the refugees. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. He had won the first skirmishes by redefining the battlefield. But the enemy was now recalculating. His window of security, bought with cracked reeds and a bleeding knee, was slamming shut. The final line in his journal that night was not an observation about the forest. It was a stark numerical assessment of his own campaign. 7 for 7. But the 8th will be different. He did not know how. He only knew the silence that followed the gunfire was now the most frightening sound of all. The change came not with a patrol, but with a single piece of paper. Hauptmann Vogel placed it on Piotr's kitchen table on the morning of June 20th. It was a Feldgendarmerie directive, stamped with an eagle and swastika. Magdalena stood frozen by the stove, her hands covered in flour. The air smelled of baking bread and cold authority. "New protocols," Vogel said, his voice flat. He pointed to a paragraph. "Effective immediately. All reconnaissance patrols in Sector 7 will consist of no less than 8 men. They will be accompanied by 1 tracking dog. Patrol intervals are reduced from 6 hours to 90 minutes. Piotr's blood went cold. 8 men. A dog. 90 minutes. His mathematical mind instantly calculated the implications. His network of solo triggers and localized sounds was obsolete. A dog would find his scent trails. 8 disciplined men would not be spooked by noises from the flanks. They would form a skirmish line and sweep directly through them. "The partisans here are clever," Vogel continued, tapping the map where Piotr had created his phantom resistance. "They use tricks, sounds, distractions. Childish but effective. This ends now. We will flood the sector with men until their tricks have no room to breathe." Piotr nodded slowly, his face the same mask of neutral comprehension. Inside, his mind was racing, scrabbling for purchase like a man on a crumbling cliff. The system he had built over weeks was invalidated in one morning. The refugees had moved deeper, but they were not yet safe. Father Tomasz needed 3 more days to establish the new camp. "You will assist," Vogel stated, not asked. "The sweep operation begins in 72 hours. 200 men from the 23rd Security Division. You know the terrain. You will guide Lieutenant Krebs and his team to all viable hiding areas." He looked at Piotr, his eyes no longer those of a fellow forester. "Do you understand?" "I understand." Piotr said, his voice gravel. After they left, the cottage was silent for a long time. Magdalena wiped her hands on her apron, leaving gray streaks. "What will you do?" Her voice was barely audible. Piotr looked at the directive on the table. The official paper, the precise language, the overwhelming force it represented. It was the logic of the machine. It was unbeatable. "I will guide them," he said. Magdalena's eyes widened. He saw not betrayal in them, but fear for his soul. "I will guide them," he repeated, "to where the forest is loudest." His new plan was born of sheer, desperate terrain knowledge. The Germans were bringing numbers and dogs. He could not fight numbers. He could not fight a dog's nose. But he could use the terrain to multiply his forces. He needed the forest itself to become the enemy. He identified the bottleneck, a valley 3 kilometers east of the refugee route. It was a natural funnel, 200 meters wide, flanked by steep, rocky slopes. The main German advance would have to pass through it. The valley had one peculiar property he had noted 20 years earlier. It acted as a perfect acoustic amplifier. A sound made at the northern end echoed and overlapped, creating a distorted chorus that seemed to come from everywhere. Locals called it the Whispering Valley. For 3 days and nights, Piotr became a one-man sabotage corps. He did not sleep. He moved with a frantic mechanical energy that bypassed his pain. His task was not to scare, but to confuse and delay an army. First, he sabotaged the very concept of a guide. He created 3 false priority routes on his own maps, leading to dead ends, swampy ground, and impassable thickets. He made the ink look faded, the lines deliberate. He would present these to Lieutenant Krebs. Second, he weaponized the dogs. He collected wolf urine from territory he knew was marked by a strong, dominant pack. He soaked rags in it and hung them high in trees along the edges of the valley. To a tracking dog, the air would be saturated with the scent of its natural predator, overwhelming any human trail. He used 27 rags, spaced every 70 meters. Third, he rebuilt his sound system for scale. He could not be in multiple places, so he created automated sequences using tripwires and falling weights. A rock, balanced on a ledge, tied to a wire that, when pulled, would tumble down the slope, creating the sound of many footsteps. A series of hollow logs positioned to turn the wind into a low moan. He built 14 of these installations. Each took between 2 and 4 hours to construct without leaving tool marks. His fingers became a mass of splinters and shallow cuts. The physical cost was astronomical. On the second night, while hauling a 40-kilogram stone up a slope, he felt something tear in his lower back. A hot, sharp pain lanced through him. He fell to his knees, biting down on a leather strap to keep from crying out. He lay in the dirt for 20 minutes, unable to move, staring at the stars. The pain receded to a constant fiery ache. He stood up. He kept working. He also prepared his masterpiece, the Valley of Echoes. At the narrowest point, he strung 12 separate wires across the gap, each attached to a different sound device. Clusters of dry branches, sheets of loose bark, cans filled with pebbles. A single patrol, tripping one wire, would create a minor noise, but a column of 200 men would trigger them all in a cascade, unleashing a rolling wave of sound that the valley would amplify into a roaring avalanche of noise. On the morning of the sweep, Piotr met Lieutenant Krebs and a command group of 5 officers. Krebs was a thin man of 32 with eyes that missed nothing. He shook Piotr's hand, his grip dry and firm. "The Forester. You will show us where the forest hides its secrets." Piotr nodded. He presented his falsified maps. Krebs studied them, then nodded to his radio man. "We begin with the northern route." For 8 hours, Piotr led 200 men on a tour of the most difficult, time-consuming terrain in his sector. He guided them through bogs that swallowed boots to the ankle. He chose paths that forced them to move in single file for kilometers. nullifying their numerical advantage. He suggested scouting detours that led to sheer rock faces. He did this all with the calm authority of an expert. Krebs watched him, his expression unreadable. The Germans were professionals. They did not complain. They marched. But Piotr saw the fatigue in their eyes, the slowing of their pace. He was not fighting them. He was exhausting them. On the second day, they entered the Whispering Valley. The German formation stretched out, a gray snake entering the green funnel. Piotr walked beside Krebs at the head of the column, his heart a hammer against his ribs. This was the moment. A soldier in the middle of the column tripped the first wire. A crackle of branches echoed from the eastern slope. The soldiers paused, looking around. Then another wire snapped, then another. The cascade began. Stones rumbled, logs creaked. The wind-catching devices began their low groan. The valley took every sound, multiplied it, and threw it back in a chaotic, deafening orchestra. To the disciplined German soldiers, it did not sound like tricks. It sounded like an entire battalion maneuvering in the woods above them. The column compressed, men moving closer together. Officers shouted orders that were lost in the din. The tracking dogs went wild, straining at their leashes, confused by the wall of wolf scent and the overwhelming noise. Krebs stopped. He turned slowly, surveying the slopes, then looked directly at Piotr. His gaze was not angry. It was analytical. "A clever place for an ambush," he shouted over the noise. "But there is no one here to ambush us. Is there, Forrester?" Piotr met his eyes. He said nothing. Krebs smiled, a thin, cold curve of the lips. He had seen through the deception, but he could not prove it, and the practical effect was the same. His column was delayed, confused, and demoralized. The sweep's momentum was broken. The operation was called off that evening. Krebs cited inconclusive results and unsustainable terrain losses. 2 soldiers had sprained ankles. 1 dog had gone lame. They had found nothing. Piotr returned to his cottage in a state of near collapse. He had won. He had delayed a battalion with echoes and wolf piss. But Krebs's smile was burned into his mind. The lieutenant knew. The adaptation was over. The next phase would not be a sweep. It would be a surgical hunt, and the primary target would no longer be a phantom partisan unit. The final entry in his journal that night was stark. Sweep repelled. Time bought. 3 days. Cost. Anonymity. He was no longer an invisible spirit of the forest. He was a man on a ledger. The enemy had adapted to his tricks. Now they would adapt to him. He had 72 hours before the new directive was issued. He knew what it would say. It would not mention patrols or dogs. It would contain a single name, a description, and the words, "to be detained for questioning." He had taught them the power of his knowledge. Now they would come to take it from him, along with his life. The metal box was found on September 18, 2019. It was buried 40 centimeters beneath the root system of a lightning-struck oak in Sector 7 of the Białowieża Forest. A Polish archaeology student named Katarzyna Nowak discovered it with a ground-penetrating radar anomaly. The box measured 30 by 20 by 15 centimeters. It was sealed with wax. Inside were 14 hand-carved willow reeds, a leather journal, and a photograph of a man and woman standing before a timber cottage. The journal's final entry was dated October 30, 1943. It contained 2 words, 47, enough. The discovery made local news. Historians cross-referenced the journal with declassified Wehrmacht reconnaissance reports from 1943. The documents told a story of frustration. Patrol reports described unnatural sounds, impossible movements, and a pervasive sense of being watched. One intelligence summary estimated a partisan strength of 30 to 50 men in the sector. Another recommended diverting an entire security company to clear the area. The recommended operation was cancelled due to strategic shifts on the Eastern Front. The Phantom Army had vanished. Piotr Kowalski stopped his campaign in late October 1943. The immediate German pressure on his sector eased as resources were diverted to the collapsing front lines. The 11 refugees, guided by Father Tomasz along the Cairn path, reached a Soviet encampment in November. All survived the war. Piotr lived for 20 more years. He returned to his forestry work. He walked the same 18-kilometer circuit until 1958. He never spoke of the summer of 1943. His daughter Ewa recalled that he would wake at precisely 347 hours twice a month, sitting upright in bed, his breath coming in short gasps. He would then go to the kitchen and sit in silence until dawn. He never explained why. He stopped using animal calls entirely. When his grandson asked him to teach bird sounds in 1960, Piotr refused. He said the forest had forgotten how to speak truthfully. He died of a heart attack in 1963 at the age of 73. His funeral in Krasna was small. 17 people attended. He was buried under a simple stone. Magdalena placed wildflowers on his grave every spring until her own death in 1981. She never remarried. In a letter to her sister found after her passing, she wrote, "I lived with 2 men. The one who left in 1943 never came back. I loved them both. Father Tomasz served the Krasna parish until 1967. He died at 86. His private diary, unsealed in 2005, contained a single entry about Piotr. Dated January 1946, it read, "He comes to church but does not pray. He sits, he listens. He is waiting for a sound that never comes. I believe he is listening for forgiveness from the trees. They do not answer." The 11 refugees scattered across the globe. Their fates were tracked by a historian in the 1990s. Anna Zielinska, age 8 in 1943, became a schoolteacher in Chicago. She died in 2011. Mikhail Misha Petrov, age 19, the Red Army soldier with the broken arm, returned to Leningrad. He worked as a factory foreman. He never told his family about his escape. He died in 1989. The Rosen family, 4 members, emigrated to Tel Aviv. The father, David Rosen, opened a bakery. He suffered from severe claustrophobia for the rest of his life, unable to enter small rooms. The 2 children, siblings aged 5 and 7, were adopted by a family in Łódź. The elder, now named John, became a doctor. He never learned the name of the forester who saved them. On the German side, Hauptmann Dieter Vogel was killed in action during the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945. His body was not recovered. Lieutenant Klaus Krebs survived the war. He returned to Hamburg and worked as a postal clerk for 33 years. In a 1978 interview for an oral history project, he discussed the Białowieża operations. He said, "We were not fighting men. We were fighting a ghost. The forest itself was the enemy. It was a tactical paradox. You cannot arrest a tree." He died in 1992. His grandson, a history professor, published the interview in 2005. The mathematical outcome of Piotr Kowalski's campaign is clear. Patrols diverted. 47 confirmed. German casualties inflicted by his actions. 0. Refugee lives saved. 11 confirmed. German resources diverted. Estimated at 200 man-days and a cancelled company strength sweep. Duration of active campaign, 29 weeks. Ammunition expended, 0 rounds. The human cost is measured in silence. Piotr experienced night terrors for 20 years. He abandoned his core skill, animal calls, for life. He lived with a persistent back injury and knee pain until his death. Magdalena lived with a stranger for 2 decades. The refugees carried unnamed trauma, manifested as phobias and silence. In 2021, the Polish Institute of National Remembrance debated recognizing Piotr Kowalski's actions. The committee was divided. Some argued he was a resistance hero. Others noted he never fired a shot, never joined a formal network, and his methods were psychological, not military. A compromise was reached. He was posthumously awarded the Cross of the Silent Forest, a non-combat citation for civilians who used unique knowledge to resist. The ceremony was attended by 3 of his great-grandchildren. They had known him only as a quiet old man who disliked sudden noises. The 14 reeds are now displayed in the Białowieża Forest Museum. They rest on dark velvet under a glass case. A small plaque reads, "Tools of Acoustic Deception, 1943. Visitors often overlook them. They look like children's toys, not weapons." Modern acoustic analysts who studied the journal in 2020 concluded that Piotr's understanding of sound propagation was instinctual but accurate. His mapping of echo points in the Whispering Valley aligned with digital sound models. One researcher noted, "He wasn't creating sounds, he was conducting the forest's own orchestra. The instruments were already there." The final question has no clean answer. Who won? The refugees lived. That is a victory. The German war machine was minimally inconvenienced. That is a tactical footnote. Piotr Kowalski saved lives but lost his connection to the world that defined him. That is a tragedy. The forest regrew. The oaks he marked still stand. The animals still call. The reeds are silent. In the end, there is only the arithmetic of survival against the geometry of a shattered psyche. 11 lives measured against 20 years of night terrors. A 0 in the casualty column, against a man who could no longer bear to listen to the birds. The museum display does not provide a conclusion. It presents the facts, the tools, the map, the photograph. The choice of meaning belongs to the viewer. The ancient forest continues its slow life. It does not care about patrols or ghosts or the cleverness of men. Wind moves through the same pines. Rain falls on the same clearings. And if you stand very still in the Whispering Valley at dawn, you might hear it. Not a boar's roar or a wolf's howl, just the wind. A neutral, enduring sound that was there before Piotr Kowalski and remains long after. Some weapons leave no physical scar. Some victories have no celebration. Some men fight a war without ever becoming soldiers. The forest keeps their secrets. The reeds do not speak. The man who carved them lies under 2 stones, one simple, one official, both telling different stories of the same silent man. Piotr Kowalski stopped 47 German patrols with willow reeds, 0 bullets, 11 lives saved, but he woke screaming at 3:47 a.m. for the next 20 years. His wife wrote, "The man who left in 1943 never came back." Here's the question this channel exists to answer. When a school teacher's basket hides weapons, when a farmer's road becomes a trap, when a priest's church repairs cripple an army, who decides what counts as resistance? The textbooks or the people who lived it? If you believe expertise beats firepower, subscribe. We tell one forgotten story every day. Stories where knowledge, not courage, was the weapon. Where the price of victory was measured in nightmares, not medals. Like if you stayed for the full hour. The algorithm punishes long-form content. Your engagement proves there's still an audience for depth. Comment with one word. The profession that could stop an army today. Electrician, nurse, IT specialist. Piotr was a forester. Who would it be now?